Welcome back to One Boring Historian. Before we start, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Are you listening at 2 a.m. with the lights low? Or on a quiet morning when the world still feels half asleep? Drop it in the comments. I like to imagine the map slowly filling with night owls and early risers who all somehow ended up here, in the same corner of history. Now, close your eyes for a moment and picture this. Before there were gods, before temples and thunderbolts and stories of heroes, there was only the land, endless mountains, restless seas, and a people trying to make sense of them. When the wind roared, they thought it spoke. When the earth shook, they believed it was alive. And from that awe and fear, the first stories began, whispers that would grow into the vast, immortal world we now call Greek mythology. If you enjoy long, quiet journeys through the ancient and the strange, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and stay a while. Here, we keep history calm, fascinating, and boringly accurate. Now, let's begin. It is a quiet afternoon in a room overlooking a garden. The light is soft, the kind of pale gold that seems to belong to no particular era. On the desk, there is a fragment of a clay tablet, no larger than a palm. The markings upon it are not words, not as we would recognize them, but the ghost of a script, Linear B, a language of inventories and offerings. It lists, in a careful, bureaucratic hand, quantities of olive oil and barley, dedicated to a name, Po-say-star-shu. The entry is dry, administrative. It speaks of a transaction, not a revelation. And it is here, in this mundane record of a sacred tithe, that we might begin, not with a thunderclap, but with the slow, patient scratch of a stylus in damp clay, a sound that would have been as familiar to its maker as the ticking of a clock is to us. To understand the world before the Olympians, one must first try to forget the marble perfection of Zeus and Hera, the defined hierarchies and elaborate mythologies that would come to dominate the classical age. We must instead step back into a landscape that is older, stranger, and far less certain. This is the Greece of the 3rd and 2nd millennia before our common era. It is a world not of unified belief, but of countless local intuitions. The air itself feels different. It is thick with presences that have not yet been given names, or whose names are known only to a single spring, a single mountain, a single grove of ancient oaks. Our journey begins, as so many journeys into deep time do, on an island, Crete. Here, the Minoan civilization flourished in labyrinthine palace complexes, their walls adorned with leaping dolphins and live bull dances. There are no grand temples here, no colossal statues of gods demanding obedience. The divine, for the Minoan, was immanent. It was in the very substance of the world, in their art. We see a reverence for the natural cycle, a fascination with the burgeoning of life and the stark reality of death. A famous sarcophagus from Hagiography shows a scene of offering. Women pour libations into a large vessel between two double axes, while a male figure plays the lyre. The focus is not on a deity receiving the offering, but on the act itself, the ritual that sustains the delicate balance between the human and the cosmic. Their central divine figure, if one can be discerned, is a goddess. She is often shown with serpents coiling round her arms, or standing atop a mountain flanked by lionesses. She is not one goddess, but perhaps many, or perhaps a single, multifaceted presence, the mistress of animals, the goddess of the caves, the protectress of the household. She embodies the fertile, terrifying power of the earth. She gives the wheat and the olive, and she commands the earthquake and the storm. There is no story about her, no genealogy. She simply is. And alongside her, in the dark, cool depths of the cave sanctuaries at Psychro or Amnisos, offerings were left. Simple clay figurines of humans and animals, exquisitely crafted vessels. These were not bribes to a capricious god, but gifts left in a place of power, an acknowledgement of a force that was both mother and monster, to the mainland. Meanwhile, the Mycenaeans were building their citadels atop high hills, their massive cyclope and walls speaking a language of power and permanence. They were different. People, more warlike, more hierarchical, from their palace centers at Mycenae, Pylos and Thebes. They administered kingdoms and traded with the wider world, and it is in the fire-blackened ruins of their archives that we find our first, tantalizing glimpses of the name that would one day echo through Homer. The linear tablets, those meticulous records of the palace bureaucracy, give us Zeus Dewey, Hera, Poseidon Poseidon, Athena Athena, and Hermes Himaha. But we must be careful not to see the pantheon of Olympus in these scribal notations. These names, inscribed next to measures of grain and oil, are likely those of local deities, patrons of the palace and its king. Poseidon appears frequently, not as the god of the sea we know from later myth, but seemingly as an earth-shaker, chthonic power connected to the land and its stability. He receives offerings of honey and cloth, a far cry from the trident wielder of the Aegean. These are the raw materials of belief, the divine names that were current, important enough to be recorded by the accountants of the king, the stories, the personalities. The intricate family relationships, all of that lay in the future, in the Dark Age that would follow the collapse of this Bronze Age world. How, then, did these early people explain the world? Let us consider something fundamental. The sound of thunder. For us, it is a meteorological phenomenon, explained by the rapid expansion of air heated by lightning. The explanation is complete. And in its completeness, it drains the event of its primal power, for the Mycenaean warrior standing on the walls of Turns, or the Minoan farmer tending his vines on a hillside in Crete. It was not so simple. The sound would have rolled across the landscape, not as an abstract force, but as a presence. It was a voice. It was the cracking of the sky itself. It was immense, undeniable, and utterly beyond human control. It did not need a complex myth. It was the myth happening in real time. The explanation was the experience itself. The sky was alive, and it was speaking in a tongue of terrible power. The name Zeus, Dewey, might later be attached to this phenomenon, but initially, the sound and the divinity were one and the same. The god was not in the thunder. The thunder was the god manifesting, or consider the turning of the seasons. In a society utterly dependent on the rhythms of agriculture, the death of nature in autumn and its rebirth in spring was the central drama of existence. The story of Persephone and Demeter, which would later be codified in the Homeric hymn, has its roots in this deep, preliterate anxiety and hope. Before it was a narrative with characters, it was a pattern felt in the bones. The withering of the vine, the barren fig tree, the parched earth of late summer, this was a time of dread. It was a goddess in mourning. The first grain shoots breaking through the cold soil were not just a botanical event. They were a miracle, a sign that the world had not been abandoned, the rituals that grew up round this cycle. The offerings to the barley mother Demeter is a name that likely derives from an earlier form, meaning just that, were acts of sympathetic magic, a human effort to participate in and encourage this cosmic return. The story came later as a way of clothing this fundamental, terrifying cycle in a form the human mind could grasp and recount. And then there's the final, unanswerable question. Death. The early Greek view of the afterlife was it seems. A shadowy and vague one. The Mycenaeans buried their elite in Grand Tholos tombs, beehive-shaped structures buried in the earth, filled with grave goods for the journey. But the destination was not the Elysian fields or the torments of Tartarus. It was, simply, the house of Hades, a dank, dark place where the psyche, the breath soul, went to lead a witless, grey existence. The name Hades itself, ID, appears in the linear tablets, but again, not as a lord of the dead, but likely as a personification of the unseen, the fate that awaited all. Death was a descent into the earth, a return to the cold embrace of the chthonic powers from which life had sprung. The elaborate geography of the underworld, the river Styx and Acheron, the ferryman cairn, these were the creations of a later, more narrative age, attempts to map the ultimate terra incognita. This was the raw material, a world alive with unnamed power, a collection of localized spirits and forces, and a handful of divine names recorded by palace scribes, the catalyst that would begin to fuse these elements into a coherent system was a catastrophe. Round 1200 BC, the world of the Mycenaean palaces and the Minoan trading networks came to a violent, fiery end. The causes are still debated: invaders, internal strife, climate change. Systems collapse, but the result was an unraveling. The great palaces were burned and abandoned. Literacy, in the form of linear B, vanished. The population plummeted. What followed was a period we call the Greek Dark Ages. It was in this long, quiet twilight, in the absence of kings and accountants, that the real work of myth-making began. With the collapse of centralized power, the maintenance of culture fell to the local village, the tribal group, and most importantly, to the storyteller. The oral tradition, which had always existed alongside the formal cults of the palaces, now became the primary vessel of memory and meaning. Round humble hearts, in the light of a single oil lamp, the tales were told and retold. And it is here that the slow, patient work of personification began. A spirit of a particular spring, over generations of storytelling, might acquire a name and naiad. A terrifying rumble in the earth was no longer just a sound, but the footstep of the Enosi Gaius, the Earth Shaker, a title that would later be firmly attached to Poseidon, the complex. Often baffling emotions that drive human action, the sudden burst of courage in battle, the maddening fog of lust, the clever idea that drives unbidden, these two needed explanation. They were felt as external forces, visitations from outside the self. And so, the storytellers began to give them form. Ours was not yet the god of war, but the palpable, screaming fury that descended on a warrior, the Lyssa that made him a wolf. Aphrodite was the sweet, irresistible power that drew a man and a woman together, a power as tangible as the wind. The process was not one of invention, but of accretion. Like a river stone smoothed over centuries, the rough, localized beliefs were slowly worn down and shaped by the constant flow of narrative. A story told in one village would be heard by a traveler, carried over a mountain pass, and blended with the story of the next village. The names from the linear tablets, the Zeus and Hera and Poseidon, were like sturdy hooks as the stories traveled. These names, perhaps once belonging to minor local deities or even powerful ancestral figures, began to accumulate the attributes of countless other spirits and forces. They grew in stature and complexity. They began to form relationships, to marry, to betray one another, to have children. They became a family, a chaotic, squabbling, gloriously human family that happened to possess control over the cosmos. This was not a theological decision made by priests. It was a natural, organic process of the human mind seeking order through narrative, the unpredictable chaos of the World was tamed by being turned into a story about a dysfunctional divine household. If the seasons changed, it was because a mother was mourning her daughter's annual departure to the underworld. If a storm ravaged the coast, it was because the Earth-Shaker was in a quarrel with his sister. The world, in all its beauty and terror, became intelligible. It became a place where things happened for a reason, even if that reason was the petty jealousy of an immortal. And so, over centuries of quiet storytelling, in the dim light of a world recovering from collapse, the first faint outlines of Olympus began to take shape. Not as a physical mountain, but as a concept, a divine court that mirrored the forgotten palaces of the Mycenaean Phoenix. The world was no longer just a collection of isolated, powerful places. It was becoming a cosmos, ordered and explained by a pantheon whose characters were as flawed and as passionate as the humans who told their tales. The birth of belief was not a single event, but a slow, patient dawn, illuminated not by the flash of lightning, but by the gentle, persistent glow of a storyteller's fire. There is a certain quality of light in a museum hall in the late afternoon, when the last voices have faded and the dust motes drift like suspended thoughts through the angled sunbeams. It is a patient, contemplative light, the kind that slows the pulse of time and invites not a glance, but a gaze. In that hush, one might stand before a case of ancient fragments, not the grand, restored vases that command attention, but the broken, catalogued shards, the curved bit of black on terracotta that might once have been a shoulder, the faded ochre stroke that could have been a chariot wheel, the chipped edge of a rim where a geometric pattern ends abruptly in silence. There is no clear story there, only the mute evidence of a world that thought and made and sought to make sense of itself. And it is in such a light, I think, that we should approach the beginning of things not with thunder and proclamation, but with stillness. Creation, as the Greeks understood it, was not a single, spectacular moment. It was a condition, a gradual articulation out of unformed potential. Before there was form, there was chaos. The word deceives us. Today, chaos suggests disorder and noise, but its older root, to gape or yawn means something quieter and more fundamental, the vast, yawning gap, imagine. Not darkness, for darkness can only exist beside light, but a state where such distinctions have no meaning, no up or down, no before or after, no presence to cast a shadow or absence to define a void. It is not emptiness, but something deeper, lack of definition itself, like a canvas before it is stretched, or the silence before sound. Chaos was potential waiting to be realized, from that undifferentiated openness. Things began to be. Hesiod's Theogony describes it in simple, passive terms. They came to be. No craftsman shaped them, no divine will commanded them. Existence itself began to coalesce out of possibility. The first to emerge was Gaia, the earth broad-breasted and eternal, the secure foundation of all things. She was not born upon something. She was the something. She represented the first solidity in the great, formless sea of potential. From the same abyss rose Tartarus, a deep, misty pit beneath the earth, as far below as the heavens are above. If Gaia was the first definition of form, Tartarus was the definition of depth, her negative, her shadow. Soon after came Eros, the most beautiful among the deathless gods, the limb loosener who overpowers the mind and compels all beings toward union. This Eros was not the playful child of later poetry, but a cosmic principle, the impulse that draws the separate together, the glue of creation itself. Without him, the newborn world would have remained a scattering of disconnected things, never touching, never changing. From chaos also came Erebus, deep darkness and Nyx, the night, whose own union brought forth ether, the bright uprear, and Hemra, the day. Out of obscurity came illumination, from night, the seed of morning. This rhythm of opposition, light from dark, fullness from void, was how the Greeks imagined the world defining itself, and so the first architecture of the cosmos took shape, the solid earth, the depths below, the bright sky implied but not yet realized, and between them the invisible pulse of attraction. Yet Gaia was alone, and in her solitude she performed the first creative act. Without consort, she brought forth Ouranos, the sky, equal to herself, to cover her on every side. He was her complement, her counterpart, the arching dome that met her contours exactly. Where she was the foundation, he was the enclosure. Where she was form, he was limit. Their union completed the world's first symmetry. From Gaia then came the mountains, the graceful homes of the nymphs and Pontus, the sea. Vast and restless, the world gained elevation and movement. Its edges began to breathe out of stillness came geography. The union of earth and sky produced a new generation of beings, the Titans, 12 in number, each a principle of the emerging world. Oceanus, the encircling river, Cuis and Phoebe, the twin lights of intellect and prophecy, Crius, the raw strength of matter, Hyperion and Thea, who would give birth to the sun, moon and dawn, Iapetus, father of Atlas and Prometheus, from whom mankind's restless curiosity would descend, Themis, divine law, Mnemosyne, memory, Tethys, the fertile water, Rhea, nurturer and the youngest, Cronus, wily and ambitious. Together they embodied both the grandeur and the danger of creation forces of form that could as easily destroy as sustain. But Gaia and Ouranos' union also yielded monstrosities, the Cyclops Brontes thunder, Stropes lightning, and Arges bright. Each bore a single eye in the center of the forehead, symbols of unrestrained elemental power. More terrible still were the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, a chaotic excess of strength. They represented power without proportion, energy unshaped by reason. Ouranos looked upon these children and recoiled. He loathed them, Hesiod says, and hid them away. Perhaps he saw in their forms a reminder of the chaos from which he himself had emerged a threat. To the symmetry and order he imposed upon the world. To keep them from light, he forced them back into Gaia's body. Burying them within the earth's depths, every birth became imprisonment. Every act of creation turned to suppression. The embrace of sky and earth became a suffocating confinement. Gaia groaned under the strain. The weight of her hidden children filled her with pain and rage. From her anguish she forged a weapon, a sickle of grey adamant, unbreakable and sharp as necessity itself. Gathering her Titan offspring, she revealed her plan to overthrow their tyrannical father. Yet they hesitated, too fearful of the vast, enclosing sky to act against him. All but one, Cronus, cunning and unsentimental, agreed. When night fell and Ouranos descended upon Gaia, as he always did, the trap was sprung. From his hiding place, Cronus reached out with his left hand, seized his father, and with his right swung the sickle. He did not kill the skyhawk in the heavens die, but he maimed him. With that violent stroke he severed the bond between heaven and earth. The static unity of the cosmos was shattered. The sky recoiled upward, separating forever from the earth below, leaving between them space, air, and the possibility of time. From the blood that fell upon Gaia's surface came new life, the Erinyes, avengers of kinslaying, the Gigantes, born for conflict, and the Meliae, nymphs of the ash tree. And when Cronus cast the severed genitals into the sea, the foam that formed round them gathered and gave birth to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, from hatred, beauty, from mutilation, desire, Even in violence, the universe found renewal. With his father dethroned, Cronus ascended as ruler. He released the Cyclops and the Hundred-Handed, but soon bound them again, fearing their strength. The pattern was already set, each generation born from rebellion, each new ruler becoming what they had overthrown. The struggle for order, the fear of chaos, it was an endless cycle. Under Cronus and his sister wife Rhea came the Golden Age, still, and troubled time when gods and mortals lived without toil. Yet prophecy hung over him. Gaia and the wounded sky had warned that he, too, would be undone by one of his own children, and so Cronus, haunted by his father's fate, swallowed each newborn the moment it emerged into light. What began as a struggle between heaven and earth became the tragedy of family generation. Devouring generation, the cycle of fear made flesh. This entire mythic chain from the yawning void to the castration of the sky and the rise of Cronus is more than a story of gods. It is an attempt to make sense of existence itself. The Greeks were not recording miracles. They were reasoning through metaphor. Why is the sky separated from the earth? Why does the world give birth to beauty and terror alike? Why does every act of creation seem to contain destruction within it? Their answer was not mechanical but psychological, not historical but human. They imagined a world whose birth required rupture. Where separation was the first act of life, the sky's retreat from the earth created space for breath, movement, and time, the conditions of consciousness. Every boundary in nature, every rhythm of day and night, sea and shore, reflected that primal tension. Existence, in this vision, is never still. It is always defining itself against its own opposite. Even the violence of these myths carries in austere logic. Creation requires division. The perfect unity of earth and sky was suffocating. Only through wounding could the world unfold. Out of pain came distance, and from distance, awareness. The Greeks understood that order is not given but fought for, and that the struggle itself is eternal. The poetry of Hesiod does not thunder with divine certainty. It lists, describes, observes. Its power lies in that restraint and the quiet recognition that existence unfolds not from will, but from necessity. The gods of these beginnings are not moral beings, but personified forces. Gaia, endurance, Ouronos, stasis, Cronus, time's cunning, Eros, the binding pulse. Each generation embodies both creation and its eventual corruption, and here, perhaps, lies the deeper truth the Greeks intuited, that the world's order is always temporary, its peace always precarious. Every stability carries within it the seeds of rebellion, every act of creation the shadow of destruction. The cosmos, like the family, survives through cycles of rupture and renewal. To read these old lines is to glimpse a way of seeing that feels strangely modern. The Greeks did not imagine a perfect world fallen into sin, nor a divine plan unfolding toward harmony. They saw the world as dynamic tension, a universe that must continually wound and heal itself to endure. The same pulse that tore heaven from earth gives rise to the tides, the seasons, the human heart. And so, standing again in that quiet museum light, before the fragments of a civilization that once sang these stories, we sense what they sensed, that beauty and destruction are not opposites, but partners in the dance of existence. The shard and the whole vessel share the same play. The silence and the song depend on each other. The Greeks did not fear chaos. They knew it was the beginning of everything, the fertile gap out of which light and darkness, love and vengeance, even gods themselves, must continually be born. Creation, they understood, is not a single miracle at the dawn of time, but an endless process, renewed with every fracture, every act of separation, every breath drawn between what is and what might yet be. To understand the nature of a revolution, one must first appreciate the architecture of the regime it seeks to overthrow. The rule of Cronus and his Titan siblings was not an age of shining temples and heroic deeds, but something far more primal and epic when divinity still mingled with matter. When the gods were not yet personified, but were the elements themselves. This was the age of the earth, a time when the divine was thick and imminent, woven into every mountain, river, and wind. The Titans did not rule over the natural world. They were the natural world, the sun's unlinking blaze, the sea's ceaseless pulse, the currents of thought and memory that moved like unseen tides through the cosmos. Their dominion was vast, raw, and unrefined. It was not moral, nor orderly. It simply was ancient, powerful, indifferent. Such an order, enormous and unmoving, could not last, for all its magnitude. It lacked motion, innovation, and change. The Titans were pillars, not architects, and their ruler, Cronus, sat upon a throne of fear, his authority built not upon consent or cooperation, but upon suppression. He maintained his rule through one terrible, perfect lauded the suppression of the future. Cronus had learned from his father's downfall, where Ouranos had tried to prevent his children from being born. Cronus devised a subtler tyranny. He would allow them to enter the world, but not to remain in it. His dominion was not over the womb, but over the moment after birth. It was the ultimate expression of paranoia disguised as prudence. If every air is consumed, no heir can rise. His sister and consort Rhea bore him 5 children in sorrowful succession: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. And as each divine infant entered the light, Cronus waited, patient and implacable, with the same motion, always unhesitating. He took each newborn into his hands and swallowed them whole. They did not perish. Divine essence cannot die. They lived, trapped and conscious. Within the dark furnace of their father's gut, gods unborn, gods remembered, their potential digested by the endless present. It was tyranny transformed into metabolism, the eternal now devouring the not yet. The court of Cronus was a silent one. No laughter of children echoed through its halls. The future had been swallowed, and what remained was stasis, majestic, heavy, and breathing. For a time, he must have believed himself invincible. He had conquered succession itself, reduced time to a single, unending meal. But time, as the Greeks understood, cannot be eaten. It eats back. When Rhea grew heavy with her 6th child, something within her rebelled. The ache of loss had accumulated into defiance. No mother could endure the annihilation of every birth. Her pain was more than personal, it was cosmic. The cycle of creation itself was choking. In secret, she went to her parents, Gaia and the distant, wounded Ouranos, who still brooded over the edges of the sky. They understood her despair, for they had seen this pattern before the child turning tyrant. The parent made prisoner of their own creation. Together, they devised a plan. When her time came, Rhea withdrew from the gleaming palaces of Cronus and journeyed to Crete, an island still untouched by the politics of heaven. We must imagine not the warm, sunlit Crete of later myth, but a secret landscape, a hidden valley veiled in mist, fragrant with resin and earth, its depths alive with the murmurs of unseen water. In a cave whose stones glistened with moisture, she gave birth to her last son, Zeus. The child's first breath stirred the darkness. There were no witnesses but the nymphs of the island and the listening earth itself. Rhea, trembling with exhaustion and fear, performed the act that would alter the fate of gods. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth, a simple, round, river-worn stone, cool and inert. Then, pressing a final kiss to her real son, she handed the disguised bundle to Cronus. The king of the Titans, blind in his certainty, asked no questions. He had consumed 5 children already. What was one more? He took the bundle, swallowed it, and felt satisfaction settle in his stomach like a stone, which, in this case, it literally was. Believing the prophecy and done, he relaxed. Rhea, meanwhile, hid her true son deep within the Cretan cave, under the care of divine guardians, the Curetes, armed dancers who clashed their shields in rhythmic fury to drown out the child's cries. Thus was Zeus raised in secret his lullaby a war drum, his cradle the living earth, years past. Though in mythic time they are more felt than counted, Zeus grew strong in solitude, nourished by goat's milk and honey, learning the patience of stone and the suddenness of storm. He was not like his forebears. Where Uranus was the all-enclosing vault and Cronus the consuming cycle, Zeus was movement itself, the gathering thunderhead, the surge that breaks stagnation. He was a god born not to preserve the order of the world, but to strike it into motion. When his strength was ripe, Gaia again counseled rebellion. Zeus did not storm his father's throne with armies or thunderbolts, not yet. His first weapon was cunning. Disguised as a chimera, he infiltrated Cronus's court, serving the tyrant as a loyal attendant. The devourer drank deeply, trusting the hand that filled his cup. But this cup held not wine, it held retribution. Zeus mixed within it a potion of mustard and honeyed wine, a divine emetic given to him by Gaia herself. Cronus, unsuspecting, drank. The stillness of his reign convulsed, his stomach churned. He who had swallowed the future began to vomit it back into being. First came the stone-still swaddled, slick with divine bile which would later be set at Delphi, the Omphalos, navel of the world. Then, one by one, the swallowed gods emerged, not as infants but as fully formed, radiant beings, their essence tempered in the darkness of their father's belly. Out came Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hesture born not in innocence, but in fury. For the first time, the children of Cronus stood together in the light. They had not known each other in life, but they shared the intimacy of captivity. Their alliance was immediate and absolute. They turned to their brother Zeus, the liberator, who had done what none before him had achieved. He had reversed the devouring cycle. But Cronus, even weakened, was no ordinary foe. His rage shook the heavens. The Titans, hearing of his humiliation, rallied to his side on Mount Othes. Thus began the Titanomachi, the war of gods and Titans, the first and greatest revolution. The battlefield was the universe itself. The Titans fought with the slow, crushing force of nature, storm, flood, earthquake. Their power was that of mass and duration, the inexorable weight of the world. The Olympians fought with brilliance and speed, with air and light. Their weapons the forces that flash and vanish, but can remake a mountain in a heartbeat. The war lasted 10 years, echoing through every stratum of existence. Zeus, realizing strength alone could not defeat eternity, turned to strategy. He sought allies where his father had made enemies. Descending into the depths of Tartarus, he approached the imprisoned Cyclops and Hecatoncheires, there amid the darkness that pulsed with the echo of creation's first chaos. He offered them freedom not as slaves, but as brothers in rebellion, grateful and terrible. They agreed. The Cyclops, master forgers of the divine, armed the Olympians with their symbols of power. For Hades, they made the helm of invisibility, so that he might move unseen among his enemies. For Poseidon, they crafted the trident, whose strike could fracture land and churn the depths, and for Zeus, they made the thunderbolt, the pure, electric essence of divine authority, the first light in the sky after endless shadow, The war that followed was elemental theatre. Zeus hurled his thunder, shattering the air with fire. Poseidon's trident cracked the land, and Hades cloaked himself in unseen dread, turning brother against brother in confusion. Yet even this celestial artillery could not tip the scales until Zeus unleashed his final advantage. He released the Hecatoncheires, these 100-handed giants, each with 50 heads. Rose like mountains in motion, their assault was cataclysmic. They seized whole peaks and hurled them as stones, their roar blending with thunder into a sound that shook even chaos. The Titans, ancient and immovable, found themselves buried beneath the very world they had once embodied. The war ended not with annihilation, but with containment for beings so fundamental. Destruction was impossible. They could only be bound. Zeus cast them down into Tartarus, deeper even than before, and sealed the prison with gates of adamant and bronze. The Hecatoncheires, once the oppressed, became the jailers, their immense bodies standing sentinel over the abyss. Thus the old order was not erased, but confined its echoes lingering as earthquakes, its sighs rising through volcanic vents from. This victory came a new division of power. Zeus and his brothers drew lots to determine their realms, acknowledging chance as the only true arbiter among equals. Zeus won the sky, the seat of command and perspective. Poseidon took the sea, the restless, ever-shifting border between worlds. Hades received the underworld, the unseen foundation beneath life. The earth itself and Mount Olympus would remain common ground, the shared domain of all. Olympus was no abstraction. The Greeks knew it as a mountain, real and visible, yet perpetually crowned with mist. But in their imagination, it was more than stone. It was the idea of perfect order, a place above storm and decay, where the air was calm and clear, where nothing aged or died. Homer describes it as untouched by wind or rain or snow, a place where a bright radiance spreads on every side. It was less a location than a state of being, serenity elevated into architecture. Within those halls of divine light, the new gods established a court. Their palaces, crafted by Hephaestus, gleamed with imperishable brilliance, golden pillars, bronze floors, walls that shimmered like captured dawn. They feasted on ambrosia, drank nectar, and spoke with voices that carried authority across the world below. But unlike the silent courts of Uranus or Cronus, the air of Olympus was alive with argument and laughter, persuasion and dissent. Here lay the true revolution. Zeus, though supreme, was not absolute. His rule was maintained through counsel, through discourse, through the interplay of rival powers. Here, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo each had a voice, a will, a sphere. Olympus was not tyranny, but polity. Power no longer resided in mere force, but in balance. The cosmos itself had evolved from singular oppression to a complex, dynamic order, a divine reflection of what mortals would one day call civilization. The Titanomachy, then, was not merely a myth of succession. It was the symbolic moment when the cosmos shifted from raw existence to governance, from nature to culture. The Titans represented inertia, the grandeur of being without awareness. The Olympians represented consciousness, decision, and the creative spark of thought. The victory of Zeus was the triumph of intelligence over enormity, of collaboration over isolation. Yet the echoes of that old world were never fully silenced. Deep within Tartarus, the Titans still groaned, their rumbling shaking the foundations of mountains. The Greeks saw in earthquakes and tempests the reminder that no order is absolute, no peace permanent. Even the rule of Zeus was provisional, a delicate equilibrium between restraint and chaos. Discipline and desire. A world, for the first time, had a government, but beneath every law, in the depths of every heart and every trembling fault line, There remained the memory of the Titans, a reminder that creation, however divine, is always built atop the ruins of what came before. To stand before a classical statue of Zeus the Poseidon from Artemisium, perhaps, or later Roman copies of Phidias as colossal Olympian, is to confront an image of settled and absolute power. The brow is broad, the beard tightly curled, the musculature of a mature athlete in his prime. No longer the lithe youth, but the established champion. The eyes, even in weathered marble, seem to gaze on a fixed and orderly horizon. He is the embodiment of cosmos, a word that meant both order and adornment, the beautiful arrangement of things. This is the Zeus who won the Titanomachy, who drew the lot for the sky, who presides over the council of the gods. He is the king, but to understand the profound and ambiguous relationship the ancient Greeks had with their chief deity, one must look past the serene marble and into the storm clouds gathering behind it. For the rule of heaven was a complex and often contradictory edifice, built as much on terror and passion as it was on justice and law. His primary symbol was the thunderbolt. It was not merely a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of his authority, forged for him by the Cyclops in the crucible of the war against the Titans. And like a sword or a spear, which require proximity and personal force, the thunderbolt is a weapon of remote judgment. It strikes from a distance with instantaneous and terrifying force. It is indiscriminate in its immediate. Evexit can shatter an oak tree or incinerate a mortal who has sworn a false oath with equal finality. Its rival is preceded by the gathering gloom and the rumble of distant thunder, a warning that often comes too late. This was the essence of Zeus's power. It was pervasive, atmospheric, and ultimately inescapable. He was not a god who walked among men, like the trickster Hermes. He was the god whose presence was felt in the charged air before a summer storm, in the sudden, deafening crack that splits the sky. His rule was not intimate, it was meteorological. This remote power formed the bedrock of his role as the guarantor of Dike justice and Themis' divine law and order. Themis, who was both a Titaness and one of his earliest wives, represented the fundamental, unwritten laws of the universe, the way things are meant to be. From their union were born the Horae, the seasons, who govern the orderly progression of time and the fertility of the earth, and the Morae, the fates, who spin, measure, and cut the thread of life for every being. Mortal and immortal, this familial connection is deeply significant. It shows Zeus binding his raw power to the ancient, pre-existing structures of the cosmos. He does not create justice, he upholds it. He is the executive power to Themis' legislative constitution. He was the protector of suppliants, of strangers, and of the sacred oath, the Hawkos. To break an oath sworn in his name was to invite not merely his personal displeasure, but a fundamental disruption of the trust that binds human society together. In this aspect, Zeus was the divine archetype of the patriarchal ruler, the paterfamilias of the world, whose primary concern was the maintenance of a stable, functioning order. Yet, this image of the just king exists in constant, creative tension with another, far more problematic aspect of his nature, his relentless, often predatory, sexuality. The catalogue of Zeus's lovers divine, nymphic, and mortal is extensive, a foundational element of Greek mythology that cannot be dismissed as mere colorful anecdote. These are not simple stories of infidelity. They are profound, often dark, narratives that explore the nature of power, obsession, and the consequences of divine attention. His pursuit of these lovers is almost never a matter of courtly romance. It is characterized by metamorphosis and deception. He came to Dinar as a shower of gold, penetrating the bronze chamber where her father had imprisoned her. He abducted Europa in the form of a beautiful, placid bull, carrying her across the sea to a new continent that would bear her name. He seduced Leda as a swan. He pursued the nymph Io as a cloud. And when Hera grew suspicious, he transformed the maiden into a white heifer, condemning her to years of torment and wandering. To analyze these myths is to look into the heart of the Greek conception of power. Zeus' transformations are a means of achieving his desires while circumventing the obstacles presented by mortal fathers, jealous wives, or the very nature of his divine majesty. But they are also a reflection of the overwhelming, transformative, and often destructive force of divine will upon the mortal plane. A mortal does not have a love affair with Zeus. They are acted upon by him. They are caught in a cosmic event, like a tree in a lightning strike. The consequences are life-altering, rarely entirely happy. They result in the birth of heroes like Heracles and Perseus, figures who would shake the world. But they also result in exile, madness, and the relentless fury of Hera. These stories served as a powerful theological and social lesson. The attention of the ultimate power in the universe is dangerous. It is capricious, it is consuming, and it operates by a set of rules entirely separate from human morality. The king of the gods is not a moral paragon. He is a force of nature who also happens to be the guarantor of oaths. Nowhere is this contradiction more starkly illustrated than in the myth of Prometheus. The Titan Prometheus, whose name means forethought, was a complex figure who straddled the worlds of the old order and the new. He had fought on the side of Zeus in the Titanomachy, yet he maintained a defiant sympathy for the wretched race of mortals, who lived in darkness and misery. The conflict between God and Titan revolves round two central acts. The first was at Mecone, where a sacrificial ox was divided. Prometheus wrapped the nourishing meat and entrails in the unappealing stomach of the ox, and hid the bare, white bones in a glistening layer of rich fat. He then asked Zeus to choose which portion the gods would receive for eternity. Zeus, though not deceived, chose the gleaming fat, thereby establishing the sacrificial practice for all future time. Humans would keep the meat for themselves and burn the bones and fat as an offering. To the gods, it was a cunning trick, a narrative that explains the origin of ritual and establishes a fundamental distance between mortal and immortal needs. But the second act was the truly transgressive one. Prometheus, pitying the shivering, ignorant humans, ascended to Olympus and stole fire from the hearth of the gods, hiding it in a hollow fennel stalk and bringing it down to earth. Fire was more than just warmth and protection from predators. It was technology, culture, civilization itself. With fire, humans could cook food, smelt metal, forge tools, and ultimately build cities. They could move from a state of nature to a state of culture. The response of Zeus was swift, terrible, and twofold, revealing the layered nature of his rulership. His first act was one of pure, punitive vengeance against humanity. The beneficiaries of the theft, he commanded Hephaestus to fashion the first woman, Pandora, a beautiful evil, endowed with gifts from all the gods, but possessing a deceitful heart. She was given a jar often mistranslated as a box containing all the sorrows, toils, and diseases that would now plague humanity. When she opened it, these evils were released into the world, leaving only hope inside under the lid. This was a profoundly pessimistic ideological myth, explaining the origin of human suffering not as a primordial mistake, but as a deliberate, calculated punishment from the king of the gods for the act of receiving a gift of knowledge. His second act was the direct punishment of Prometheus. The Titan was seized and carried to the ends of the earth, to the desolate, wine-scoured crags of the Caucasus Mountains. There, he was bound to the rock with unbreakable chains, and every day an eagle, the emblem of Zeus himself, would descend and tear out his liver. Every night the liver would regrow, ensuring that torture was eternal. The imagery is excruciatingly specific. The liver was considered the seat of passions and emotions. Its perpetual devouring represents the endless consumption of the Titan's very being, his compassion for humanity becoming the source of his eternal agony. The story of Prometheus lays bare the political theology of Zeus's regime. The theft of fire was not merely a theft of property. It was an act of insubordination that threatened the established hierarchy. By gifting civilization to humans, Prometheus was empowering them, making them less dependent, more godlike. Zeus's punishment was designed to re-establish the proper distance, to remind both Titan and humanity of the absolute and unassailable nature of his authority. His justice, in this case, is not about fairness, but about the maintenance of power. It is the raw, brutal response of a sovereign to a challenge against his monopoly on the tools of civilization. And yet, the myth does not simply end with the triumph of tyranny. Prometheus holds a secret. He knows the prophecy about a future son of Zeus who would overthrow him, just as he overthrew Cronus. This knowledge is his power, the leverage that eventually, after generations of torment, leads to his release by the hero Heracles, his son of Zeus. This crucial detail completes the complex portrait of Zeus's rule. He is all-powerful, but not all-knowing. He is the king, but he is subject to the decrees of the Moirae, the fates, his rule. For all its thunderous majesty is not absolute. It exists within a system of constraints, including the power of prophecy and the potential for his own future downfall. This, then, is the multifaceted, often contradictory figure of Zeus that the ancient Greeks worshipped. He was the cloud-gatherer, the father of gods and men, the protector of the city and the home, the god before whose altar oaths were sworn and justice was sought. His was the power that made the world coherent, that kept the seasons turning and the social order intact. Politically, he was the divine model for the Basileus, the king, whose authority was necessary for stability, but whose whims and passions had to be managed and appeased religiously. He was the ultimate recipient of sacrifice, the distant, powerful figure who had to be honored, not out of love, but out of a prudent understanding of his capacity for both benevolence and wrath. Morally, he was a profoundly ambiguous figure. He was the guarantor of justice, yet he himself often acted unjustly by human standards. He was the author of order, yet his own desires were a constant source of disorder and chaos in the lives of gods and mortals alike. The Greeks did not require their gods to be morally perfect. They required them to be powerful and real. In Zeus, they saw a reflection of the world itself, beautiful and terrible, orderly and chaotic, just and capricious. His reign was not a utopia, but a complex, functioning system a cosmos built, like the world they knew, on a fragile but enduring balance between the ideal of law and the reality of power. To look upon the statue in the temple was to be reassured by the order it represented, but to hear the thunder roll in the distance was to remember the raw, untamed, and dangerous force that underpinned it all. The establishment of the Olympian order was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new, more complex one. With the Titans imprisoned and the cosmos divided, the universe now had a ruling family. And, like all families, its dynamics were an intricate web of alliances, resentments, passions, and a quiet, enduring tension between the ideal of harmony and the reality of discord. To understand the Greek conception of the divine, one must move beyond the solitary figure of Zeus on his throne and step into the interconnected world of his immediate kin, his wife, his brother, and his sister, whose domains were not just territories on a map, but profound aspects of the human experience. We begin with Hera. To modernize, she is often reduced to a single, potent characteristic, the jealous wife. Her myths are a litany of rage and vengeance against the countless lovers and illegitimate children of Zeus. She hounds the hero Heracles from his infancy, sending serpents into his cradle and later driving him to a fit of madness where he slays his own children. She torments the mortal woman Io, transformed into a heifer, placing her under the 100-eyed god Argus and sending a relentless gadfly to sting her across the world. She prolongs the Trojan War and works against the Greeks because the Trojan Prince Paris did not. Award her the golden apple of discord. This portrayal, however, while accurate to the narratives, is a superficial reading. To see Hera merely as a spiteful queen is to misunderstand her fundamental nature and her vital, if difficult, role in the cosmic order. Hera was the goddess of marriage. Her full title was Hera Teleia. Hera the fulfilled, representing the completed, sanctified, and legally binding union between a man and a woman, in a world where the family unit, the oikos, was the absolute bedrock of society, economics, and legacy. Hera's domain was not a sentimental one. It was the very architecture of civilization. She was the divine embodiment of the marriage contract, a covenant that demanded absolute fidelity for its legitimacy and power. From this perspective, Zeus's constant infidelities were not merely personal slights. They were a direct, continuous, and public assault on the very institution she personified and protected. Her wrath was not the petty jealousy of a scorned woman, but the righteous, systemic fury of a principle whose foundational laws were being violated by the one who was supposed to be its chief enforcer. She was, in effect, the divine prosecutor of a cosmic law that even the king of the gods was bound to uphold. Her worship reflected this duality. Her most magnificent temple was the Heraion at Argos, and most famously, the Heraion at Olympia, which predated even the temple of Zeus. These were not small, intimate shrines, but vast, imposing structures of stone and timber. Here, rituals of profound solemnity were performed. The most sacred was the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, a ritual reenactment of the union of Zeus and Hera, believed to have taken place on the island of Samos or in the region of Boeotia. This ceremony, involving the procession of a cult statue and symbolic rites, was not a celebration of romantic love, but a potent piece of sympathetic magic. Its purpose was to ensure the fertility of the land, the stability of the social order, and the continuation of the community. Hera's fury and Hera's blessing were two sides of the same coin. To honor her was to acknowledge the terrifying power and absolute necessity of the vows that held the world together. A prayer to Hera was an appeal for legitimacy, for the sanctity of the household, and a tacit acknowledgement of the catastrophic consequences that followed when that sanctity was broken, if Hera's domain was the structured world of the city and the home. Her brother Poseidon's was the formless, chaotic, and necessary element that surrounded it. The sea. The Greeks were a people of the sea. It was their highway, their source of sustenance, and their most common grave. Poseidon, the earth shaker, was the master of this ambiguous realm. His symbol was the trident, a three-pronged spear with which he could stir the waves into a murderous frenzy, shatter ships into driftwood, or strike the land itself to create springs and provoke earthquakes. He was a god of immense and terrible power, as unpredictable and moody as the deep itself. One moment, he could provide a calm passage, a tailwind that carried heroes home. The next, he could unleash a storm of such fury that it would erase all traces of a vessel and its crew, consigning them to the silent, lightless halls of his brother. His realm was one of profound duality. The surface of the sea was a place of travel and trade, but also of utter disorientation, far from the sight of land. The depths were a world of hidden wonders and primordial monsters. Sailors making offerings to Poseidon before a voyage did so not with the expectation of love, but with the desperate hope of appeasement. The sacrifices were often of horses, an animal sacred to him, or of bulls, whose dark blood would swirl in the water as a potent offering. The prayer was a transaction, a bribe offered to a capricious and volatile force. There was no guarantee of safety, only the mitigation of risk. A successful voyage was proof that the god's temper was, for a time, placated. His temples were often built on dramatic headlands, jutting out into the surf. Places like the magnificent sanctuary at Salion, whose white marble columns served as a landmark for sailors and a place to offer last-minute prayers before rounding a dangerous cape. The atmosphere at such a site was not one of peaceful contemplation, but of awestruck terror. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below was the constant, percussive voice of the god, a reminder of his presence and his power. To worship Poseidon was to acknowledge humanity as smallness in the face of a nature that was vast, impersonal, and overwhelmingly powerful. It was a relationship based on fear, respect, and a pragmatic understanding that life depended on navigating a force that could never be controlled. And then there was the third sibling, Hades, who ruled the third portion of the world, the underworld. His name itself was so feared that it was rarely spoken aloud in daily life. He was more commonly referred to as Platon, the Rich One, a euphemistic title that acknowledged the vast, silent population of the dead and the mineral wealth that lay hidden in the earth. While Zeus commanded the sky and Poseidon the sea, Hades presided over the final, universal human destination. His domain was not a place of punishment or reward in the early Greek imagination that would come later with more developed concepts of the Elysian fields and Tartarus. Initially, it was simply the place of the dead, a grey, joyless expanse where the shades, or idola, of the departed existed as faint, withered echoes of their former selves. The kingdom of Hades was defined by its absolute finality. It was bounded by 5 rivers, the most famous being the Styx, the river of hate, by which the gods swore their most binding oaths. The ferryman Charon would, for a coin placed in the mouth of the deceased, pull the shade across the water. At the gate stood the 3-headed hound, Cerberus, whose purpose was not to prevent entry, but to ensure that no one ever left. This was the core of the Greek dread of death, not pain, but loss. The loss of vitality, of sensation, of identity. The shade of the great Achilles in the Odyssey tells Odysseus that he would rather be a landless slave on earth than a king among the dead. Because of this profound and somber nature, Hades had very few temples. One did not build a shrine to invite his presence. His worship was chthonic of the earth and conducted in propitiation. Not for blessings, offerings to him were black animals, whose blood was drained into a pit so it could seep downward. The rituals were performed at night, with averted eyes. The most significant ceremony involving him was the story of his abduction of Persephone, which explained the cycle of the seasons, but for the average Greek, direct interaction with Hades was minimal. He was the one god whom every person would eventually meet, but whom no one wished to invoke prematurely. Prayers were not offered to him. He received the dead. His presence was felt in the silence of a tomb, in the chill of a sudden draught in a sunlit room, in the profound, unanswerable mystery of what lay beyond the final breath. To acknowledge Hades was to confront the ultimate limitation of all mortal ambition, the silent, patient truth that underwrote the vibrant, chaotic, and passionate drama of life under Zeus and Poseidon. Together, this divine family, the king, the queen, the earth shaker, and the unseen one, formed a complete, if fraught, picture of the Greek world. Zeus represented the authority and order one aspired to, the ideal of a just ruler. Hera represented the binding social structures that made civilization possible, with all their demands and consequences. Poseidon represented the untamed, dangerous, yet essential natural world that had to be negotiated for survival, and Hades represented the inescapable horizon of that existence, the final, democratic destination that gave weight and poignancy to all that came before, their conflicts, their passions, and their separate, sovereign powers mirrored the human experience. Life was a matter of navigating the laws of the city here, the whims of fate and authority Zeus, the perils of the natural world Poseidon, all under the shadow of a final, silent reckoning Hades, the rituals, the temples, the prayers from the grand public spectacle of the Hieros Gamos to the private. Fearful libation poured into a crack in the earth were the tools with which humanity sought to map this complex terrain. They were not simply telling stories about gods. They were using these divine personalities to articulate the forces psychological, social, and natural that shaped their fragile, magnificent, and terrifying world. If the reign of Zeus and his siblings established the fundamental architecture of the world, the sky, the sea, the underworld, the sanctity of the oath, then the generation that followed represented the furnishing of that world with meaning. This was the birth of intellect, of art, of the measured harmony that separates civilization from mere survival. It is a shift in the divine narrative, from the raw, elemental struggles of the previous age to the emergence of qualities we might recognize as distinctly human, albeit perfected and magnified to a divine scale. And the clearest expression of this new consciousness arrived in the most startling manner possible, through a splitting open of the very skull of the king of the gods. The story of Athena as birth is one of the most singular and unsettling in all of mythology. It begins not with a union, but with a prophecy. Zeus was told that the Titaness Metis, his first wife and the embodiment of cunning wisdom, would bear 2 children, a daughter of unparalleled wisdom and a son who would wield a thunderbolt and overthrow him. This was the old, cyclical pattern of succession reasserting itself, the ghost of Ouranos and Kronos looming over the new throne. Rather than repeat the devouring sin of his father, Zeus chose a different, yet equally absolute, form of containment. He swallowed Metis whole, absorbing her counsel and her very being into himself, making her wisdom an internal, permanent part of his own sovereignty. In time, a terrible pain began to build within Zeus's head. The source was not a stone, as with Kronos, but the fully formed and armored goddess who had been conceived and was now ready to be born from the mind of her father. The agony became so immense that the order of the cosmos was threatened. In some versions of the myth, the smith god Hephaestus is summoned. He does not administer a potion, but takes up his great bronze axe, the tool used to split timber, and with a single, precise, and terrifying blow, he cleaves open the skull of the king of the gods. From this fissure in divine consciousness, Athena emerged. She did not arrive as a mewling infant, but as a fully grown adult woman, clad in gleaming, golden armor, a sharp spear in one hand, and a mighty, piercing war cry on her lips. The other Olympians looked on in awe and terror as she stood before them, her grey eyes shining with a cool, unearthly light. This origin defines her completely. Athena is thought embodied. She is strategy, not brute force, the measured plan. Not the chaotic fury. She is civilization itself, born not from the womb of a mother, but from the intellect of a father. She is the patron of the city, specifically Athens, which she won in a contest against Poseidon. The god of the sea struck the Acropolis with his trident, and a salt water spring burst forth. Athena, in response, merely touched the rocky soil with her spear, and an olive tree sprouted, grey-green and resilient. The olive meant food, all for light and cleansing, wood for carving, and a symbol of peace and prosperity that could be cultivated and sustained. The city, understandably, chose her gift. Her connection to the people was not one of fearful appeasement, as with Poseidon, but of collaborative intellect. She was the goddess of the demos, the citizen body, of the assembly where words, not weapons, were meant to decide fate. Her great temple, the Parthenon, which crowns the Acropolis, is the ultimate architectural expression of her nature. It is not a place of dark, chthonic mystery, but of brilliant, mathematical clarity. Its columns, with their subtle emphasis, appear perfectly straight to the eye. A triumph of reasoned perception over all measurement, the sculptures that adorned it. The metopes and the frieze depicted not only the battles against giants and centaurs, the triumph of civilization over savagery, but also the Panathenaic procession, a grand, public ceremony where the citizens of Athens, young and old, male and female, wove a new peplos robe for her ancient cult statue and presented it to her. This was worshippers. Civic participation, a reaffirmation of the social contract between the goddess of wise counsel and the city that embodied it. To stand in the shadow of the Parthenon, even in ruins, is to feel the presence of an intelligence that sought to order the world according to principles of balance, proportion, and collective purpose. If Athena represented the cool, clear light of reason applied to the polis, her half-brother Apollo represented that same light applied to the realms of the spirit, the body, and the arts. His rival at Olympus was less violent, but no less definitive. He was the son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, and his birth on the floating island of Delos was accompanied by the emergence of his twin sister, Artemis. From his very first hours, he was associated with the killing of monsters, slaying the great serpent Python that guarded the oracular site at Delphi, thus cleansing the place for his own establishment. Apollo is the most complex and multifaceted of the Olympians. He is the god of the lyre, whose music brings harmony and order to the wild passions. He is the god of archery, whose arrows can spread plague, striking from a distance with the same unerring accuracy as his sisters, but often as a form of divine punishment. He is the god of healing, who taught humanity the art of medicine, and most famously, he is the god of prophecy. The voice of Zeus at Delphi, the omphalos, the navel of the world. The oracle at Delphi was the psychological and spiritual center of the Greek world for centuries. It was not a simple shrine, but a vast complex built on the terrifying, awe-inspiring slopes of Mount Parnassus. The process of consultation was a slow, expensive, and elaborate one. O petitioner, be they a private citizen or the emissary of a powerful city-state, would first make the arduous climb, purify themselves in the Costolian spring, and offer a costly sacrifice if the signs were favorable. They would be admitted to the presence of the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo. She was typically an ordinary woman of the region, chosen for a life of chastity and service. On the day of the oracle, she would descend into the inner chamber, the adyton, and seat herself on a tripod over a fissure in the rock from which intoxicating vapors were said to rise. She would chew laurel leaves, sacred to Apollo, and enter a trance state. Her utterances were often ecstatic, incoherent, wild. They were then translated into often ambiguous hexameter verse by the male priests of the temple. The most famous dictum, "Know thyself," was carved at the entrance, a permanent reminder that the search for external truth must begin with internal examination. This entire process, the chaos of the Pythia's ecstasy, filtered through the formal structure of poetry, is a perfect metaphor for Apollo's domain. He is not the god of raw, untamed inspiration that belongs to the Dionysian realm. He is the god who imposes form upon chaos. He is the principle that takes the wild, incomprehensible martyrings of the earth and the unconscious, and shapes them into something that can, however difficultly, be interpreted and understood. His light is not the gentle glow of dawn, but the brilliant, unforgiving glare of the midday sun, which reveals all things clearly. Without shadow or comfort, his temples, like the one at Delphi or the sanctuary at Delos, were places of stark, breathtaking beauty, where geometry and landscape met to create a sense of piercing clarity. A prayer to Apollo was a plea for purification, for healing, for a glimpse of the future, and for the strength to bear the often unwelcome truth that was revealed. And then there is Artemis, Apollo's twin, the lady of the wild things. If Apollo is the sun, she is the lunar cooler, more remote, but no less powerful light. Her birth, preceding her brothers, was swift and painless, and she immediately acted as midwife for her mother, establishing her eternal role as a protector of women in childbirth. But this is only one facet of her paradoxical nature. She is a perpetual virgin who presides over the transition from girlhood to womanhood. She is the mistress of animals, who protects the young of all creatures, yet she is also a deadly huntress whose arrows bring sudden, painless death. Artemis represents the untamed world that exists just beyond the boundary wall of the city, the wilderness that is both nurturing and fiercely dangerous. She is not a fertility goddess in the sense of Demeter, who governs the cultivated field. Artemis is the spirit of the ancient forest, the mountain slope, the untouched marshland. Her followers were the nymphs, and her companions were the wild animals. To encounter her in the myth was a perilous thing. Actaeon, a young hunter, stumbled upon her bathing in a secluded grove. For this unintentional violation of her privacy, she transformed him into a stag, and he was torn apart by his own hounds. The message was absolute. Her domain was inviolable. The rules of the city did not apply here. Her worship reflected this. While she had temples, the most famous being the Artemision at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, her most potent rituals were conducted in the wild. In places like Bruron, young girls, the Octor or Shebes, would perform dances and rituals in her honor, serving the goddess for a time before marriage, enacting a period of wildness before being integrated into the civilized order of the polis, her. Arrows could bring a swift death to women, but they could also protect them. She was a paradox, a fiercely independent female power in a pantheon and a society dominated by male authority, and her power was such that this authority never challenged her. She answered to no one but her father, Zeus, together. Athena, Apollo, and Artemis form a powerful triad of celestial influence. They are the children of light. Not darkness of form, not chaos. Athena brings order to society and warfare. Apollo brings order to the spirit, the body, and the arts. Artemis brings a kind of sacred, untamable order to the natural world. They represent the highest aspiration of the Greek spirit, the city as a reasoned community, the individual as a balanced and healthy being, and the acknowledgement of a sacred, wild purity that must forever remain beyond the city walls. To walk through an olive grove on the slopes below the Acropolis, to hear the whisper of the leaves, is to hear the voice of Athena. To stand in the ruins of the Tholos at Delphi, with the mountain winds humming through the few remaining columns, is to feel the presence of Apollo, and to see the moon rise, silver and cold, over a darkening forest, is to know that the watchful eyes of Artemis are upon you. They were not just gods to be worshipped. They were the sublime expressions of a culture's deepest yearnings for wisdom, for beauty, and for a meaning that could be discerned in the very fabric of the world. The gleaming marble of the Parthenon, the measured hexameters of the Delphic oracle, The serene logic of Athena's gaze, these represent one pole of the Greek spirit, the profound yearning for order, for Sophrosyne, for a world governed by reason and proportion. But to believe this was the entirety of their worldview would be to see only the sunlit colonnade and miss the dark, fertile, and teeming forest that pressed in upon it from all sides. For the Greeks understood that the cosmos was not a perfectly calibrated machine, but a living entity, and life is as much about the breaking of forms as it is about their creation. It is in the wild, untamable gods, the deities of ecstasy, rage, and desire that we find the full, terrifying, and necessary picture of their reality. The most complex and subversive of these forces was Dionysus. His origin story is itself a tale of chaos and rebirth. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, Semele, a princess of Thebes. Consumed by a jealous Hera, disguised as an old nurse, Semele was tricked into asking her divine lover to reveal himself to her in his full and shielded splendor. Bound by an oath, Zeus complied, and the mortal woman was instantly incinerated by the divine radiance of his thunderbolts. But Zeus snatched the unborn child from her womb and sewed him into his own thigh, from which, in time, Dionysus was born a second time, thus from his very inception. He was a god of duality, born of a mortal mother and an immortal father, twice born, a god who knew the taste of death and the power of resurrection. He did not arrive on Olympus as a rightful heir, but as an outsider, a foreigner, a conqueror. His followers were not the dignified citizens of the polis, but predominantly women, the Maenads or Bacchae, who would abandon their looms and their homes, their children and their husbands, to follow him into the mountains. They were clad in fawn skins, crowned with ivy and vine leaves, and carried the thias as a fennel stalk tipped with a pine cone, a staff that was both a symbol of fertility and a weapon. In their ecstatic states, induced by the gods' gift of wine and the relentless percussive rhythm of drums and flutes, they were believed to possess superhuman strength. They could tear apart wild animals with their bare hands and suckle the young of wolves and deer. This was not a gentle pastoral. It was a sacred madness, the mania that was the direct gift of the god. The resistance to his cult is a central theme of his myths. Pentheus, the young king of Thebes, represents the rigid, rational, political order that denies the god. He tries to imprison the effeminate, smiling stranger and his frenzied female followers, seeing them as a threat to civic order. But the walls of the city cannot contain Dionysus. He effortlessly shatters his chains and leads Pentheus, now himself driven mad and dressed as a woman, up into the mountains to spy on the Maenads. They discover him, and in their ecstatic trance, led by his own mother, Agave, they tear him limb from limb. Mistaking him for a mountain lion, the mother returns to the city, triumphantly bearing the head of her son, only slowly returning to her senses to realize the horror of what she has done. This brutal narrative is not merely a warning against a specific cult. It is a profound theological statement about the consequences of denying the irrational, instinctual, and ecstatic aspects of existence. Pentheus, the man of pure reason, is destroyed by the very force he sought to repress. Dionysus was not the god of wine as mere social lubricant. He was the god of the vine itself, whose roots break apart the soil and whose fruit, when fermented, breaks apart the conscious mind. He was the liquid dissolution of the self, the return to a primal, communal unity that existed before the invention of the city wall, his great festival in Athens, the city Dionysia, where the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were performed, was a state-sanctioned, formalized channel for this same chaotic energy. The entire city would gather to watch plays about the most horrific familial murders, the most profound suffering, and the most unanswerable questions of fate, It was a controlled, civic exorcism, a recognition that the chaos had to be acknowledged, ritualized, and given a voice, lest it break down the gates and tear everything apart. If Dionysus represented the chaos within the community and the self, as represented the chaos that exists between communities, the pure, unadorned fury of war. He was the least loved of the Olympians. In Homer's Iliad, he fights on the side of the Trojans and is depicted as a blustering, bloodthirsty, and almost pathetic figure. He is wounded by the mortal Diomedes, aided by Athena, and runs crying to his father, Zeus, who calls him the most hateful of all the gods. And like Athena, who is strategy, tactics, and the disciplined courage that wins glory for the polis, as is simply the battle rage, the joy of slaughter, the metallic taste of blood, the screams of the dying. He is war not as a political tool, but as a visceral, psychological state. His companions were Deimos terror and Phobos fear, and there is strife. He had no great centers of worship, no magnificent temples that rivaled those of Apollo or Hera. His altars were often located outside the city gates, in places associated with the mustering of armies. Offerings to him were made not for blessings, but for propitiation, to turn his baleful influence away from one's own hoplites and towards the enemy. He was a necessary evil. The Greek city-state was born in and defined by warfare. To ignore the god of war was unthinkable. Yet to embrace him was repugnant to their ideals of civilization. He was the embodiment of a truth they could not avoid but did not wish to celebrate. That beneath the veneer of philosophy and art lay the capacity for pure, mindless destruction. His presence was felt not in the grand strategy of the general, but in the white-hot, terrified frenzy of the individual soldier in the press of the phalanx, where the world narrowed to the thrust of a spear and the spray of blood. And then there was Aphrodite, who wielded a power more universal and in some ways more terrifying than the spear of Ars or the thyrsus of Dionysus, the power of Eos. Born from the sea foam that gathered round the severed genitals of Ouranos, she was desire itself, the fundamental cosmic force that preceded even the Olympian order. She was not the goddess of marriage that was Hera's solemn domain, nor of tender, romantic love. She was the goddess of irresistible attraction, of the sweet, painful ache of passion, of the procreative urge that drives all life. Her power was absolute and indiscriminate. She could ensnare the mighty Zeus himself, compelling him to pursue one mortal woman after another, in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. She even mocks the other gods for their affairs with mortals, until Zeus, in retaliation, makes her fall in love with the Trojan shepherd Anchises, forcing her to experience the humiliating, consuming power of her own domain. Her most famous myth involves her affair with Ars, the god of war, while married to the lame smith god Hephaestus. She secretly lay with Ars, the sun god Helios, who sees all, reported the affair to the cuckolded husband. Hephaestus, the master craftsman, wove a net of gossamer fine, unbreakable chains, and draped it over his own marriage bed. The next time the lovers met, they were trapped in their embrace, naked and helpless. For all the gods to see, the Olympians laughed uproariously at the spectacle. This story is deeply revealing. It shows the tension between the creative, ordering principle of the artisan Hephaestus and the destructive, chaotic principles of war and raw passion Oz and Aphrodite. But it also shows the limits of that control. Hephaestus can expose the passion, he can humiliate it, but he cannot destroy it. The net itself is a work of art, a form of order, but what it contains is the chaotic, untamable reality of desire. In the end, the lovers are released and continue their ways. The force of Eros cannot be imprisoned. It can only be momentarily restrained. Her worship was widespread and took many forms. At her, Grand temples, like those at Paphos on Cyprus or on the Acropolis. She was honored as a goddess of the city and its prosperity, but in the popular imagination, she was the power that could strike at any moment. Turning the wise into fools and appending the most carefully laid plans, a prayer to Aphrodite was an acknowledgement of one's own vulnerability. She represented the terrifying and beautiful truth that the human heart is not always, or even often, governed by reason. She was the chaos at the core of the most intimate human relationships, a force as potent and unpredictable as the sea from which she was born. Together, Dionysus, Mars, and Aphrodite form a trinity of divine forces that represent the wild and tamed undercurrent of life that flows beneath the structured world of the polis. They're the gods of the body, not the mind, of instinct, not intellect, of fusion, not separation. They remind us that for all our temples and our laws, we are still creatures of blood and passion, subject to rages, ecstasies, and desires that can, in a moment, overthrow a lifetime of cultivated reason. The Greek genius was not in choosing one over the other, the light of Apollo over the darkness of Dionysus, the order of Athena over the chaos of Oz, but in creating a religious and cultural system that made a place for both. Their festivals, their tragedies, their very pantheon was a grand, ongoing negotiation between the need for a cosmos and the acknowledgement of the primal chaos that is its eternal and necessary counter. But to ignore the wild gods was to live in a fragile, deluded order, a city without foundations, destined to be shattered by the very forces it denied. The age of the gods, with its cosmic struggles and elemental passions, established the permanent, unchangeable backdrop of the world. The sky was fixed in its place, the sea given its bounds, the underworld its silent king. But a new layer of story now begins to settle over this divine landscape, like the first patina of use on a bronze shield. This is the age of heroes, a time when the boundary between the divine and the mortal became porous, when the blood of Olympus flowed, however diluted, in human veins. These were not gods to be worshipped from a distance. They were men and women, larger than life, yet bound by the same final human fate in their stories. The Greeks explored the most profound and troubling questions. What does it mean to be human in a world governed by immortal, often capricious, powers? What is the price of greatness? And where is the line between glorious ambition and the self-destructs of pride? The hero was, by definition, a liminal being. He was often the product of a union between a god and a mortal, a Diospol, a plan of Zeus, as the poets would say, to populate the world with figures of extraordinary potential. This divine patrimony granted them strength, courage, and a destiny that shimmered with possibility. But their mortality, inherited from their human mother, was the crucible in which their heroism was forged. It was their fragility, their awareness of death, that gave their deeds weight and meaning. A god cannot be truly brave, for a god cannot be truly harmed. A hero's courage lies in the act of facing mortality itself. Consider the figure of Heracles, the most iconic of all Greek heroes. His name, Heracles, means the glory of Hera, an ironic and terrible title, for his entire life was defined by the goddess's relentless persecution. His father was Zeus, his mother, the mortal Alcmene. From his infancy, Hera's hatred was a palpable force. She sent serpents to his cradle, which the baby Heracles strangled with his chubby hands. But her most devastating act was to inflict upon him, in a fit of madness, a frenzy in which he murdered his own wife and children. This is the foundational tragedy of the hero. His very existence, his divine potential, is the spark that ignites his human suffering. Awakening to the horror of his actions, Heracles sought purification. The oracle at Delphi, guided by Hera's influence, told him he must serve his weak cousin, King Eurystheus, and perform 10 labors, a number later extended to 12. These labors were not mere tasks. They were descent into the chaotic and monstrous edges of the world. He wrestled the Nemean lion, whose hide was impervious to weapons. He hunted the Erymanthian boar, cleansed the Augean stables of a lifetime of filth in a single day, and journeyed to the underworld to fetch the 3-headed hound. Cerberus, each labor is a story of immense physical effort, but also of cunning and a grim, enduring perseverance. Heracles is not a subtle hero. He is raw power and dogged resolve. His myth is one of atonement, an attempt to use his God-given strength to expiate human sin. Yet, even after completing the labors, his suffering did not end. He was poisoned by a tunic dipped in the blood of the centaur Nessus, a pain so agonizing that he built his own funeral pyre on Mount Ota and immolated himself, his mortal part burning away so his divine part could ascend to Olympus. Heracles embodies the ultimate heroic paradox. His strength, the source of his glory, is also the direct cause of his torment. His life is a testament to the idea that greatness is not a gift, but a burden, and that the favor of the gods is often indistinguishable from their curse. A different model of heroism is found in the story of Perseus. His quest was clear from the beginning: to bring back the head of the Gorgon Medusa, a being whose gaze turned men to stone. And like Heracles, Perseus does not rely solely on brute force. He is the hero as a tool of divine will, guided and equipped by the gods. Hermes gives him winged sandals and a curved sword, the harp. Athena gives him a polished bronze shield. The nymphs provide him with Hades' cap of invisibility. His victory over Medusa is a feat of intellect and precision. He does not look at her directly, but at a reflection in his shield, and with a guided, backward stroke, he severs her head. Perseus's story is one of clean, almost surgical heroism. He rescues the princess Andromeda, defeats his enemies, and fulfills the prophecy that he would kill his grandfather, not through malice, but through a tragic accident in an athletic contest. He founds cities and establishes a royal line. His myth lacks the inner turmoil of Heracles. It is a folk tale of a righteous quest successfully completed, a narrative where the gods' assistance leads to a stable and prosperous conclusion. He represents the ideal of the hero as a civilizing force, the slayer of primordial monsters who makes the world safe for human order. But perhaps the most human, and therefore most compelling, exploration of the heroic condition is found in the Iliad, in the figure of Achilles. His mother was the sea nymph Thetis, his father, the mortal Peleus. Knowing he was fated to die young if he won glory at Troy, Thetis disguised him as a girl and hid him among the women of a foreign court. But Odysseus, the man of many turns, found him out, and Achilles, presented with the choice between a long, anonymous life and a short, glorious one, willingly chose the latter. This is the heroic code in its purest form, Clio's Athidon, undying glory, purchased with blood. Yet, the Iliad is not primarily the story of Achilles' great deeds in battle. It is the story of his rage, the first word of the epic, when the commander Agamemnon seizes his war prize. The maiden Briseis, Achilles' honor is wounded. His response is not to confront Agamemnon directly, but to withdraw. He sits by his ships and refuses to fight. This is a revolutionary act, a deeply personal and psychological response that threatens the entire Greek enterprise. Achilles is not a simple killing machine. He is a man of profound, almost divine, passions, whose sense of self is so immense that the entire war becomes secondary to the insult against his time. His honor and worth His subsequent actions define the tragic arc of the hero. He allows his dearest friend, Patroclus, to enter the battle in his place, wearing his armor. When Patroclus is killed by Hector, Achilles' rage transforms from a cold, withdrawn bitterness into a white-hot, grieving fury. He returns to the battlefield, no longer for glory or for the Greek cause, but for vengeance. He kills Hector and, in a final, shocking act of transgression, desecrates his body, dragging it behind his chariot round the walls of Troy. In this moment, Achilles crosses a line. He is no longer a hero adhering to a code. He is a force of pure, unchecked passion, his humanity submerged in his grief and rage. It is only when Hector's aged father, King Priam, comes to him alone at night, kisses the hands that killed his son, and appeals to their shared experience of loss, that Achilles' humanity is restored. He weeps with Priam and returns Hector's body for burial. The poem ends not with a triumph, but with a funeral, a somber acknowledgement of the cost of heroic glory. Achilles achieves his Cleos, but at the price of everything that gave his life meaning, his friend, his own future, and for a time, his own humanity. These stories, and countless others, were not merely entertainment. They were the moral and psychological textbooks of the Greek world. They taught the concept of hubris, not simple pride, but the arrogant overstepping of one's proper place in the cosmic order. It was the sin of thinking like a god, of believing oneself above the constraints of fate and mortality. The hero, balanced precariously between the human and the divine, was uniquely susceptible to this failing. His very nature tempted him to cross the line, and his stories served as constant, vivid reminders of the inevitable, catastrophic fall that followed, the heroic code, the pursuit of glory, loyalty to one's comrades. The defense of one's honor provided a framework for a society that valued individual excellence, Yet, the myths constantly question this code. They show its hollowness, its capacity to lead to grief and destruction. The fascination for the Greeks lay in this tension. The hero is both an object of admiration and a cautionary tale. He was the proof that a human life could touch the heavens, and a grim reminder that the same life would inevitably be consumed by the earth in the ruins of Mycenae, said to be the city of Agamemnon, or in the massive walls of Trones, the home of Heracles. One can still feel the echo of that tension. The stones themselves seem to speak of a time when greatness walked the earth, a greatness that was as terrible and fleeting as a flash of lightning in a summer sky, illuminating everything for a moment before returning the world to darkness. There is a particular quality of light in the late afternoon, in the places where the ancient Greeks laid their dead. It is a thick, golden, honeyed light, heavy with the dust of cypress and myrtle. A light that seems to pool in the hollows of carved marble and stretch the shadows of funerary. Monuments into long, attenuated forms. To stand in the Keramakos of Athens, or before the magnificent necropolis of Hera, is to be surrounded by a profound and resonant silence. This is not the empty silence of a vacant room, but the deep, accumulated quiet of millennia of farewells. The stone stelae, their edges softened by the patient caress of wind and rain, show us not the terror of death, but its poignant, formalized acceptance. A young athlete holds a strigil, forever poised to scrape the dust and oil from his skin. A maiden, her chair turned towards the viewer, reaches out to take the hand of a smaller figure, a servant or a younger sibling, in a gesture of eternal departure. These stones are the starting point for any understanding of the Greek afterlife. They are the solid, sunlit anchors in the world of the living, from which we must trace the tenuous, shadowy journey of the psyche into the realm of Hades, the unseen one. The Greek conception of the soul was, like their art, both concrete and elusive. The psyche was the vital breath, the life force that animated the body. At the moment of death, it was imagined as a wisp of smoke, a faint, fluttering semblance of the person a little like the fragile, winged Eros figures on their vases escaping the lips of the deceased to begin its journey. It retained the form and memory of the individual, but it was a faded copy, a photograph bleached by time. It possessed no physical strength, no beat, and its voice was a mere squeak, a bat-like chirping that required the sustenance of sacrificial blood to momentarily cohere into intelligible speech. This was the core of the Greek dread, not the fear of punishment, but the horror of diminishment. The shade of Achilles, the greatest of the Achaeans, tells Odysseus that he would rather be the most insignificant, landless laborer on earth than the celebrated lord of all the dead. The afterlife, for most, was not an upgrade or a damnation, but a demotion into a state of profound and perpetual ennui. This journey was not a passive drifting. It was a perilous transition that required meticulous ritual preparation by the living. The proper funeral rite was the absolute prerequisite, the only currency that held value on the shores of the other world. The process was a sacred, domestic drama. The body, the soma, was first washed and anointed with oils by the women of the household, purifying it of the stains of life. As silver corn, an obol, was placed under the tongue or between the teeth, the crucial fee for the pheromone, the body was then dressed in clean white garments and laid out on a bier, the prophecies for a period of mourning, where relatives would come to lament and pay their respects. Then, before dawn on the third day, the funeral procession, the ekphra, would wind its way to the place of burial beyond the city walls. The body was cremated on a pyre. The transformative fire that consumed the physical shell and liberated the psyche for its journey. Or it was inhumed directly in the earth. The bones and ashes were then carefully gathered, placed in a ceramic lekithos or a stone chest, and buried with grave goods, a warrior's sword, a woman's mirror and jewelry, a child's toys. These objects were not for use in any practical sense in the afterlife. They were powerful, symbolic tokens of love and identity, a final, desperate attempt to project the person's essence across the ultimate boundary. The path of the soul was westward, toward the dying sun, to the very limits of the known world, where the deep, flowing oceanus encircled the disk of the earth. The entrance to the underworld was a place of mist and twilight, a landscape of gnarled, leafless trees and silent, grey shores. The first and most critical threshold was a body of water, while later poets would fixate on the river Styx as the primary boundary. Earlier and more prevalent traditions speak of the Acheron, the river of woe, or a wide, marshy lake. Its ferryman was Charon. He was not the skeletal, grim reaper of later iconography, but a dour, unkempt, and elderly waterman, his hair and beard matted, his clothes stained and simple. He was a functionary, not a judge. His sole purpose was to pole his leaky, rustic skiff across the dark, stagnant waters, and he accepted only those passengers who could present the obol, those who could not pay the hundred. The unmourned were condemned to wander the desolate, misty shore for 100 years. Their faint cries carried on the wind that never stirred the leaves of the poplar trees. This was the first and most democratic of the underworld's judgments, and it placed the responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the living. A proper death was a social contract, and to fail in this duty was to doom a soul to a fate worse than any punishment, utter neglect. Once across the water, the soul would approach the official gates of Hades' domain. Here stood the ultimate sentry, Cerberus, described by Hesiod as having 50 heads and by later authors as a more manageable 3. This hound was the son of the monstrous Echidna. His nature was paradoxical. His tail wagged in a friendly, welcoming manner for those newly arrived shades, but his multiple heads and razor-sharp teeth ensured that no one who had passed into the house of decay could ever retrace their steps. He was the embodiment of the one-way journey, the finality of death itself. To pass him was to accept that there was no return. Beyond these gates lay the heart of the underworld, the asphodel meadows. It is vital to correct the modern, romanticized notion of this place. The asphodel is not a beautiful, lily-like flower. It is a hardy, gray-green, spiky plant that thrives in poor, rocky, and sun-baked soil, often the first plant to colonize land that has been burned. The meadows were not a place of floral beauty, but of bleak, neutral monotony. This was the destination for the vast, undistinguished multitude of humanity, those who were neither great heroes nor monstrous sinners. It was a vast, twilit plain, where the shades drifted aimlessly, their forms indistinct, their memories faded. They existed in a state of aletheia, a word whose root means forgetfulness, but which here signifies a dreamlike, passive existence, devoid of joy, pain, or purpose. There was no community, no conversation, only the faint, collective rustle of innumerable lost souls. To pour a libation of blood into a sacrificial pit, as Odysseus does in Book 11 of the Odyssey, was to perform a powerful act of necromancy, temporarily shocking these shades back into coherence, granting them a fleeting, painful moment of self-awareness and memory before they faded back into the grey consensus of the crowd. This was the core whole of the Greek afterlife for the common person, the erasure of individual identity. Yet, the kingdom of Hades was not a monolithic realm of grey. It was a landscape of stark and dramatic contrasts, reflecting the Greek belief in a cosmic justice that sorted souls according to their deeds and their nature. For the extraordinary few, there were to polarize destinies. To one side, in a place often described as lying at the very edges of the world, was Elysium, or the Elysian Fields. This was not a reward for a moral virtue in an abstract sense, but a paradise reserved for those directly chosen by the gods. Its inhabitants were the great heroes and demigods, the sons and lovers of the Olympians, and later, those initiated into the profound mysteries of cults like that of Eleusis. Homer describes it as a place where life is easiest for men, where there is no snow, no winter, and no torrential rain, but the steady, gentle breath of the west wind, Zephyrus, always blows from the ocean to bring coolness to its inhabitants. Here, in a land bathed in a soft, perpetual ether, the blessed dead pursue the pleasures of their former lives, wrestling, running, playing the lyre, driving chariots but without the sweat, strain, or the inevitable approach of age and failure. It was an eternal, sun-drenched symposium, a club for the divinely connected. In direct opposition lay Tartarus. This was not merely a dungeon. It was a primordial, cosmic entity, the deep, misty pit that had existed since the beginning, the prison for the defeated titans. It was also the place of divine retribution for those mortals who had committed direct and egregious offense. Is against the gods themselves, the punishments here were not merely painful, they were exquisitely, poetically symbolic, designed to be the eternal, living embodiment of the sin itself. Tantalus, who had killed his own son Pelops and served him as a meal to the gods to test their omniscience, stood in a pool that receded when he bent to drink, beneath fruit-laden boughs that lifted away when he reached to eat. His punishment was the essence of eternal, unsatisfied desire. Sisyphus, the cunning king who had twice cheated death itself, was forever rolling a massive boulder up a steep hill, only to have it roll back down as it neared the summit. His punishment was the very definition of futility. Ixion, who had attempted to assault Hera, was bound to a fiery, spinning wheel for all eternity. These were not just warnings, they were cosmic axioms, demonstrating with terrifying clarity the consequences of attempting to transgress the fixed order of the universe, of committing the ultimate sin of hubris. The figures who presided over this grand sorting were not Hades and Persephone, the remote and majestic sovereigns of the dead who took little direct interest in the fate of individual souls. The task of judgment fell to a tribunal of 3 mortal kings who had been renowned in life for their impeccable justice: Minos, the lawgiver of Crete, his brother Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus. The pious king of Aegina, seated in the meadow at the parting of the ways, they would hear the testimony of each soul, weighing its deeds, its virtues, and its failings. The soul would stand naked, not of clothing, but of the lies and pretensions of its life, and the judges would see its essence clearly. Their verdict was not based on a codified law, but on their innate, kingly sense of dike, of what was right and fitting. This concept of post-mortem judgment was a significant evolution in Greek thought, introducing a powerful moral calculus into the afterlife. It meant that the choices made in life, not just one's birth or burial, had direct and eternal consequences. This intricate, layered vision of the afterlife provided the ancient Greeks with a framework for understanding the greatest of human mysteries. It was not a system designed to offer comfort, but to provide order and meaning. The elaborate funeral rites, the coin in the mouth, the grave gifts, the annual festivals of the dead, all were the practical, social technologies for navigating this complex geography of the soul. They were a way for the community to assert its bond with the individual, to ensure that the traveler to the unseen place was properly equipped, and to maintain a relationship with the vast, silent population of the past. To walk among the tombs of the Keramakos today is to witness the enduring power of this belief system. The grand, sculpted stelae were more than expressions of grief. They were acts of defiance against the asphodel meadows. They were a declaration to the gods, to the community, and to time itself. This person existed. This woman was beloved. This man was valiant. Do not let them be forgotten. The mythology of the underworld, for all its shadows and terrors, ultimately served this profound human need. It did not promise a happy ending, but it did offer a map. And in that act of careful, detailed cartography of the unknown, the Greeks found a way to face the long, silent journey, not with terror, but with a solemn, clear-eyed, and deeply dignified acceptance. There is a room in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens that holds a collection of small, everyday objects. Not the grand gold of Mycenae or the towering Kuru, but something more humble. A terracotta oil lamp, its surface blackened by ancient soot. On its disc, worn smooth by the thumb of its owner, is a faint, stamped image, a figure grappling with a lion. It is Heracles. Here, in this unassuming domestic item, used for a few moments of light in the long nights of the 2nd century A.D., the myth was present. It was not a subject for a temple frieze or an epic poem, but a companion to daily life. This is the true nature of the legacy of Greek mythology. It is not a relic sealed in a museum case, but a deep, persistent current in the bedrock of Western thought. A language of symbols and stories that has been translated, adapted, and reimagined for 3 millennia. Its survival is a story not of mere preservation, but of continual rediscovery, a dialogue between the present and a distant, echoing past. The first great codifiers, Homer and Hesiod, did not create this world from nothing. They were, in a sense, the first archivists of a long oral tradition, gathering the scattered threads of local legends and divine genealogies and weaving them into a coherent tapestry. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, fixed the gods and heroes in a specific, humanistic light, exploring the tragic interplay of divine will and human agency. Hesiod's theogony provided the official, if chaotic, family tree of the cosmos, a grand narrative of order wrested from primal chaos. These texts became the foundational curriculum of the Greek world, the shared cultural vocabulary every educated person was expected to know. The philosophers who followed Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics did not dismiss these stories, but wrestled with them. Plato famously sought to ban the poets from his ideal republic, fearing their depictions of capricious, immoral gods would corrupt the youth, yet he himself was saturated in their imagery, using the myth of Hera to conclude his republic, and the allegory of the cave to describe the journey. From ignorance to enlightenment, for the philosophers, myth was a problem to be solved. A riddle wrapped in narrative, containing profound psychological and cosmological truths beneath the surface of improbable events. As the political power of Greece waned, its cultural power was absorbed and transformed by Rome. The Roman gods became uneasy counterparts to the Greek pantheon, Jupiter to Zeus, Juno to Hera, Neptune to Poseidon, yet the stories remained largely the same, retold by poets like Ovid in his Metamorphoses. Ovid's work is particularly significant, for it is a sprawling, witty, and deeply human catalogue of transformations, a theme that would resonate powerfully with later artists. It was through the Roman filter and the vast administrative machinery of the empire that these stories were disseminated across Europe and the Mediterranean. With the rise of Christianity, this rich mythological tradition faced its greatest threat. The old gods were declared demons, their worship forbidden, their temples dismantled or converted into churches for a time. The current seemed to go underground, but it did not vanish. It survived in two crucial ways. First, in the marginalia of monastic manuscripts, where scribes, copying classical texts for their grammatical and rhetorical value, inadvertently preserved the stories themselves. Second, and more profoundly, the Church Fathers, particularly figures like Augustine, engaged in a complex intellectual appropriation. They argue that the pagan myths were not mere falsehoods, but prefigurations, imperfect shadows of the one true Christian story. The logos of the Gospel of John could be seen as a fulfillment of the philosophical logos of the Greeks. This act of theological recycling ensured that the names of Zeus and Apollo, of Heracles and Odysseus, were never entirely forgotten. Their grand return began in the late Middle Ages and exploded in the Renaissance. In the sun-drenched city-states of Italy, a new class of wealthy merchants and princes, hungry for a cultural identity separate from the Gothic North and the rigid scholasticism of the Church, looked back to the classical past. They saw in the fragments of Roman sculpture and the rediscovered manuscripts of Cicero and Virgil a vision of human potential, of beauty, and of intellectual freedom. This was the birth of humanism, and Greek mythology was its native tongue. Botticelli's The Birth of Venus is not a mere illustration of a myth. It is a philosophical statement. The goddess, born from the sea foam, steps onto her shell not as a pagan deity to be worshipped, but as a symbol of divine love, spiritual beauty, and the rebirth of classical ideals after the Dark Ages. The calm, ethereal beauty of the painting is a world away from the chaotic, bloody origins described by Hesiod, yet it is unmistakably the same figure in the hands of Renaissance artists. The myths were purified, their forms idealized, their narratives allegorized into expressions of a new, confident humanity, the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, with its emphasis on reason and order, might seem an inhospitable climate for tales of shape-shifting gods and monstrous creatures. Yet, the myths persisted. They became the language of power and prestige. The palaces of Versailles and Chandran are filled with ceiling frescoes where Apollo, the sun god, is a stand-in for the absolutist monarch. Louis XIV, the myths provided a ready-made visual lexicon for expressing political authority, virtue, and national destiny. Meanwhile, German scholars like Johann Joachim Winckelmann formulated an idealized vision of Greek art, coining the phrase noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. This vision, though historically sanitized, cemented the place of classical mythology as the ultimate standard of beauty and taste, inspiring a neoclassical revival that swept across Europe and the Americas, its clean lines and heroic subjects shaping everything from architecture to furniture. The 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism, brought a different perspective. The Romantics were less interested in the Apollonian order and clarity of the myths than in their Dionysian, chaotic, and sublime aspects. They saw in them not models of rational perfection, but expressions of the wild and tamed forces of nature and the human psyche. John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn contemplates a silent artifact, forever capturing a moment of mythic pursuit and ritual sacrifice. For Keats, the urn's frozen narrative is both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the enduring power of art, but also a reminder of the unbridgeable gap between the ideal world of the myth and the fleeting, painful reality of human life. This psychological reading of myth deepened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, finding its most influential interpreters in the field of psychology. Sigmund Freud mined the myths from metaphors to describe the structures of the unconscious. The Oedipus complex, drawn from Sophocles' tragedy, became a cornerstone of his theories, framing a fundamental human conflict in the language of ancient drama. Carl Jung went further, arguing that the gods and heroes were not just personal psychological complexes, but universal archetypes of the collective and conscious innate, primordial patterns of thought and behavior that are shared across humanity. In this view, we do not merely retell the story of Prometheus. We are all, in some way, grappling with the Promethean urge to defy authority in the pursuit of knowledge and progress. This brings us to the modern era. To the literature of James Joyce and the films of Hollywood, Joyce's Ulysses is perhaps the most ambitious literary engagement with myth in the 20th century. It takes the entire structure of Homer's Odyssey and maps it onto a single, ordinary day in the life of a Dublin advertising salesman, Leopold Bloom. The mythical becomes mundane. Yet the mundane is thereby elevated to the mythical. Bloom's wanderings through the city become an epic journey, his quiet homecoming a modern-day Nostos. Joyce demonstrated that the ancient patterns, the quest, the exile, the return are not obsolete. They are the very patterns by which we continue to make sense of our own fragmented, modern lives. And in the flickering light of the cinema, the myths found their newest and most pervasive medium. The Hollywood sword and sandal epic of the 1950s and 60s may seem like kitsch, but it was a powerful vector for these stories. More recently, filmmakers have returned to these wells with greater sophistication, exploring the visceral brutality of the Trojan War in Troy or the raw, emotional core of the hero's journey in adaptations of the Odyssey. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, for all its futuristic technology, is fundamentally a pantheon of modern gods, complete with familial strife, cosmic struggles, and flawed, charismatic heroes who would be instantly recognizable to a Greek audience. Thor is a new Heracles, a god of immense strength navigating a complex relationship with his father and his destiny. The stories endure because the fundamental human questions they pose endure. Why do these tales, born from the specific soil of the Aegean Bronze Age, continue to speak to us? It is because they are not, at their core, about gods and monsters. They're about us. They're about the terrifying, exhilarating burden of consciousness, the knowledge of our own mortality, which gives our every action its poignant weight. They're about the tension between our animal instincts and our civilizing aspiration, between the chaotic passions of the individual and the necessary order of the community. They map the geography of the human heart, with its capacity for sublime love, righteous fury, bottomless grief, and cunning intelligence. The myth of Prometheus is the eternal story of the innovator, the rebel who challenges the status quo for the sake of progress. The labors of Heracles are the archetypal narrative of atonement and the struggle against the monstrous aspects of our own nature. The journey of Odysseus is the universal experience of displacement, the longing for home, and the wisdom forged through suffering. To stand before that ancient oil lamp in the Athens Museum is to feel the thread of continuity. The person who held it sought, in the image of the hero, a spark of courage, a moment of identification with a greater struggle. We do the same today, whether we find it in a novel, a film, or a philosophical text. The names may change, the settings may be updated, but the essential dramas remain. The Greek myths endure not as dusty artifacts, but as a living language of vast, resonant, and endlessly adaptable vocabulary for the most enduring subject of all, the strange, glorious, and tragic project of being human. And in the quiet that follows their telling, we can still hear the distant echo of the sea from which Aphrodite was born, and the faint, haunting music of the lyre of Apollo, reminding us that the stories are not over, that we are still and always living inside them. And that is the story of Greek mythology, a world born from chaos, carried by poets, reshaped by artists, and still whispering through everything we build, write, and dream today. The gods may have fallen silent, their temples worn to stone, but their voices never really left. You can still hear them in the language we speak, the constellations above us, and in the stories we keep telling about power, pride, love, and loss. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? Midnight, morning, somewhere in between. I always like knowing where history finds you. And if you enjoy slow, quiet dives into the past, the kind of stories that don't shout, but echo, make sure to like, subscribe, and come back for the next one. Until then, stay curious, stay calm, and as always, boringly accurate.